Dad, I'm not asking anymore. The ranch is sold. Pinnacle Energy wired the funds this morning. You have until Friday to clear out your personal belongings. We left a message with the motel on Route 9. They're expecting you. My son hung up before I could swallow the sip of black coffee I had been holding in my mouth for 3 seconds. I stood there in the kitchen of the home I had built with my own hands 31 years ago, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to silence where my child's voice used to be. He thought it was over. He thought $6 million was enough to close the door on a man's life and walk away clean. I set the coffee mug down on the counter Margaret had picked out at a salvage yard in Casper, Wyoming, back in 1987. She had laughed the whole drive home because we'd strapped it to the roof of our pickup and it kept sliding toward the rear window. I remembered thinking I would do anything to hear that laugh every day for the rest of my life. I got 61 years of it. Then cancer took her 2 years ago, and I had been alone on this 300-acre ranch ever since. I looked out through the kitchen window at the open land, stretching toward the ridge. The grass was gold this time of year, the way it always turned in late October, the way Margaret always said it looked like God had poured honey over the hills. A hawk was circling slow and patient above the east pasture. Everything was still. My son thought he had just evicted a 68-year-old man from his home, but he forgot one thing. If he had stayed on the phone 10 more seconds, he would have heard me laugh. And if he had heard me laugh, he might have thought twice about boarding that flight to Scottsdale. My name is Robert Harmon. I spent 30 years as a structural engineer before I retired. I designed bridges, industrial complexes, and 3 of the largest natural gas processing plants in the western United States. I understand load-bearing structures better than most men alive, and I understand, perhaps better than anyone, that what sits beneath the surface of the earth is often worth more than everything standing on top of it. Before I tell you what I did, I need you to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Hit the like button if you believe a man has the right to protect what he built. My story is just beginning. My son's name is Marcus. He is 42 years old and has the kind of confidence that comes not from achievement, but from never having been truly tested. His wife, my daughter-in-law, is a woman named Diane who wears her ambition like perfume. You smell it before she enters the room. They live in Denver in a condominium they cannot afford, drive cars they lease, and spend money at a velocity that has always made me uneasy. When Margaret died, I watched them grieve, or I watched what grief looks like when it is performed for an audience. My son cried at the funeral. Diane wore black and held his hand, and said the right things to the right people. 2 weeks later, they sat me down at this same kitchen table and began talking about estate planning. I was still sleeping in Margaret's side of the bed because I couldn't bring myself to move to the center. And my son was asking me about liquidation strategies. I told him I wasn't interested. I told him this ranch was my home and I intended to die here, quietly, on my own timeline. He nodded and said, "Of course, Dad. Of course." And the conversation moved on to other things. 14 months later, my hip gave out. I fell walking to the barn in February and lay in the frozen mud for 40 minutes before my neighbor Frank heard the dog barking and came over to check. The surgery went well, but the recovery was long, and my son drove up from Denver and stayed for 3 weeks. I was grateful. I told him I was grateful. He brought me soup and helped me to the bathroom and drove me to my physical therapy appointments and was, during those 3 weeks, the son I remembered from when he was young. He was also, during those 3 weeks, very interested in my paperwork. He asked me twice about the deed to the ranch. He asked about the trust I had set up. He asked me whether Margaret had left anything in her name that still needed to be transferred. I answered his questions carefully, the way I answered all questions from people I trusted but was no longer certain I should. I gave him the information that was accurate but incomplete. I told him the ranch was held in my living trust. I did not tell him everything about the trust. 3 weeks after he went back to Denver, I received a document in the mail from a title company I didn't recognize. It was a preliminary report on my property. Someone had ordered a title search on my land. I called Chester Webb that same afternoon. Chester had been my attorney for 26 years. He was 74, partially deaf, and had a mind like a steel trap that had been oiled every morning for half a century. When I told him about the title search, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Robert, how much does your son know about the Iron Rock filing?" I told him what I had told Marcus. The ranch, the trust, the surface rights. Nothing below. Chester said, "Good. Sit tight. Something is moving, and I want to know what before you do." He called me back 4 days later. My son had retained a real estate attorney in Denver. He had found a buyer, Pinnacle Energy Partners, a mid-size exploration company that had been acquiring mineral-adjacent parcels across Wyoming and Colorado. For the past 18 months, Pinnacle had made an offer. The offer was contingent on a 30-day due diligence window and a clean title. Marcus had accepted. There was one problem. From his perspective, the ranch was in my living trust. He wasn't the trustee. I was. Which is why, Chester said slowly, your son is planning to petition for conservatorship. He has filed a motion in Denver District Court. The motion claims you are experiencing cognitive decline following your surgery and are no longer capable of managing your own affairs. I sat down on the porch steps. The October wind came in off the ridge, carrying the smell of pine and something colder underneath. My own son was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could sell my land out from under me. I don't know how long I sat there. The hawk I had watched that morning was gone. The gold grass moved in the wind without any particular urgency, the way nature moves when it doesn't know a war has just been declared. I could fight the conservatorship. Chester had already drafted a counterfiling. My doctor, who had seen me every 6 weeks since Margaret died, was prepared to write a letter that would embarrass anyone who claimed I was cognitively impaired. I was sharper than men half my age. I did the crossword in pen. I managed my own portfolio. I had rebuilt the fence line on the north pasture by myself 3 weeks after my hip cleared physical therapy. But fighting conservatorship takes time. Hearings, appeals, filings, the kind of time that benefits people with money and costs people who don't have liquid reserves, which is exactly what Marcus was counting on. He knew my wealth was tied up in land. He knew I didn't have $400,000 in a checking account to pay lawyers for 2 years of litigation. He was betting that I would fold before the process finished me. He had miscalculated on 2 counts. The first was that Chester Webb didn't charge me for this. He had been my friend for 26 years and he told me he would handle this one on principle. The second was that the conservatorship was never going to be necessary because Marcus had never read the full trust document. And in the full trust document, established 14 years ago, when Chester and I sat together in his office on a Tuesday afternoon while Margaret was at her book club, there was a provision that no court-appointed conservator or successor trustee could authorize the sale of real property without a unanimous resolution from the Trust Advisory Board. The advisory board consisted of 3 people, myself, Chester, and Margaret's sister Eleanor, who lived in Fort Collins and despised Marcus with the quiet, permanent hostility of a woman who had watched him mistreat her niece for 12 years. Eleanor would have voted no if Marcus had shown up at her door with a notary and a bottle of wine. But Marcus didn't know about Eleanor's seat on the advisory board. He didn't know because he had never read the trust document past the first 8 pages. The conservatorship motion collapsed on its own in 6 weeks. Marcus's attorney apparently didn't realize the advisory board provision existed until Chester filed a response that made it unmistakable. The motion was withdrawn. For 8 months, nothing happened. Marcus called on holidays, short and careful conversations about nothing. Diane sent me a birthday card with a gift card to a restaurant 2 hours from the ranch, which told me she had Googled restaurants near my zip code and chosen the first result without looking at the distance. I thanked her for it. And then, 3 weeks ago, my hip flared up again. Not the surgery site, the other hip. My doctor said it was symptomatic and wanted me to come in for imaging. I drove myself to Cheyenne for the appointment and spent 2 nights at a hotel while I waited for results. The imaging was inconclusive, nothing requiring surgery, but I was away from the ranch for 4 days. On the 3rd day, I was gone. My son drove up from Denver with a locksmith, a power of attorney document he had obtained from a notary in Adams County under circumstances I will let Chester describe in court, and a contract with Pinnacle Energy already signed on his behalf as my alleged agent. By the time I drove home on day 4, the sign was already at the gate. Property under purchase contract. Pinnacle Energy Partners. I sat in my truck at the end of my own driveway for a long moment. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't weeping. I felt a cold, clarifying anger settle over me, the way temperature drops before a front comes in, gradual, total, and warning of something large. I drove past the sign without stopping. I parked in front of the house. I went inside. I made a cup of coffee. I called Chester. The fraudulent power of attorney was enough to void the contract entirely. We both knew that. Chester could file an emergency injunction within 48 hours, and the whole transaction would evaporate before Pinnacle's wire transfer ever cleared. But I didn't want to void it. Not yet. Not like that. Chester, I said, let me ask you something. If the deal closes, if the money hits his account, and then we void the instrument, where does that leave Pinnacle? Chester was quiet for a moment. Then he said, they'd have a deed that was obtained through a fraudulent agency. Their title would be defective. They'd have to sue Marcus to recover. And since Marcus would have already spent the money, he'd be looking at wire fraud, I finished. Fraud on a federal contractor. Chester was quiet again for longer. Robert, he said, I know what you are thinking. Are you sure? I looked at Margaret's rocking chair in the corner of the living room. It was hand-carved walnut, made by her father in 1962. When my son and Diane had come through the house, I could see where Diane had moved it. She had pushed it to the side wall to look at the square footage of the room, the way you look at a room when you are measuring it for resale. She hadn't put it back. I am sure, I told Chester. Let the money clear. Let him think he won. But I want something on my end, ready to move the moment he does. I need you to pull the Iron Rock file. Now. I need to explain something to you about land. When most people think of property, they think of the surface. They think of what they can see. The grass, the fences, the house, the barn. They think ownership is the same as what you can walk on. But in the American West, in states where the geology is rich and the ground runs deep with possibility, there is a second layer of ownership that has nothing to do with the surface. It is called mineral rights, and it is entirely possible to own the ground above while owning nothing beneath it, or to own everything beneath while holding nothing above. 14 years ago, when I was reviewing my estate structure with Chester, we had a conversation about Pinnacle's predecessors, a different energy company that had been sniffing around the county, buying up parcels wherever they could find a seller. Chester had seen it before. He knew how it worked. The moment an energy company acquires adjacent parcels and establishes exploratory drilling operations, the land values on neighboring properties spike if you own the mineral rights, or become irrelevant if you don't. Chester suggested we bifurcate. We kept the surface rights in the living trust under my name, and we conveyed all subsurface mineral rights, coal, oil, natural gas, all hydrocarbons, all extractable resources to a depth of 10,000 feet, to a separate limited liability company registered in Wyoming. We called it Iron Rock Holdings LLC. Sole member, Robert Harmon. We recorded the mineral rights deed separately at the county clerk's office, filed it properly in the correct index, and then largely forgot about it for 14 years because nothing happened. No energy company came knocking. No drilling permit was filed. The land sat quiet and gold in October, and muddy in April, and mine in every season, until Pinnacle Energy arrived. Pinnacle hadn't bought my ranch because of the grass. They hadn't bought it because of the barn, or the fence line, or the view from the ridge. Pinnacle was an exploration company. They had geologists on retainer. They had seismic survey data for every parcel in this county, going back 15 years. They knew. I knew this from a conversation with Frank's cousin, who worked in their Denver office, that beneath the east pasture of my property, there was a natural gas formation that preliminary surveys valued at somewhere between $40 and $80 million in extractable reserves. They paid Marcus $6 million for the surface of the land. They needed the mineral rights to access what was underneath it. Marcus had no idea Iron Rock Holdings existed. He had never seen the separately recorded mineral deed. His attorney had run a standard title search on the surface parcel and found nothing unusual. They had not cross-referenced the mineral rights index, which in Wyoming is filed separately from the surface deed index and requires a specific search request that most residential real estate attorneys wouldn't think to make. Iron Rock Holdings still owned everything beneath the ground. Pinnacle Energy had just paid $6 million for a lid with nothing underneath it. Chester confirmed it the next morning. The mineral rights deed was clean, current, and unambiguous. Iron Rock Holdings LLC, sole member Robert Harmon, held all subsurface extractable resources to a depth of 10,000 feet for the entire 300-acre parcel. Without my permission, Pinnacle couldn't drill a single test well. Without Iron Rock's cooperation, their acquisition was worth approximately what you'd pay for comparable grazing land in this county, about $800,000. They had overpaid by $5.2 million for a parcel that gave them no access to the only reason they wanted it. Chester and I agreed to do nothing. We agreed to let the wire transfer clear. We agreed to let Marcus and Diane celebrate. I drove to the motel on Route 9. I checked into room 7 with my duffel bag, my shaving kit, and the wooden jewelry box from Margaret's dresser, the one that held her wedding ring, and the watch she'd given me on our 30th anniversary. The box was hand-painted, blue flowers on white pine, something she'd made in a ceramics class the year before she got sick. Marcus had left it on the kitchen counter without a word, as if he wasn't sure whether it was worth keeping or too guilty to throw away. I took it without speaking to him. The motel room smelled like carpet cleaner and old cigarettes. There was a laminated card on the TV stand, listing local restaurants. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the jewelry box in my lap and looked at the parking lot through the window for a long time. My son had done this. The boy whose bicycle I'd repaired every summer for 7 years. The boy I'd driven to every single track meet from 7th grade through his senior year, standing in all weather at the far turn of the oval, because that was the spot where you could see his face when he came around. The boy I'd loaned money to 3 times without ever calling it a loan, because I didn't want him to feel the weight of owing his father something. He had hired a locksmith and a fraudulent notary, and sold my land to an energy company while I was in Cheyenne waiting for hip imaging results. I opened the jewelry box. Margaret's ring caught the thin light from the parking lot lamp. I touched it once. Then I closed the box and called Chester. The money cleared on a Thursday. By Friday morning, according to the real estate records Chester was monitoring, the deed had been recorded with Marcus listed as grantor under the fraudulent power of attorney. By Friday afternoon, Pinnacle Energy's project manager, a man named Gary Briggs, had driven out to the property with a survey crew. I knew because Frank called me from his fence line. Said there were trucks out there with Pinnacle logos and men walking the east pasture with equipment he didn't recognize. I thanked Frank and told him to enjoy his evening. Saturday morning I put on the charcoal blazer I wore to Margaret's memorial service. The good one, from a tailor in Cheyenne. I shaved carefully. I put the jewelry box in the interior pocket of my truck's center console. I called Chester and told him it was time. He met me at the gate of my property at 8 in the morning. He was wearing a pressed linen shirt and carrying the kind of leather briefcase that has seen the inside of serious rooms. Standing behind him, in the uniform of the Platte County Sheriff's Department, was Deputy Harlan Oakes. Was not of Con, was Deputy Harlan Oakes, a man I had known since he was in high school and who had helped Frank dig my truck out of a ditch 2 winters ago. He was there as a witness to a lawful enforcement action. He had read Chester's documentation the previous afternoon and understood the situation completely. Gary Briggs was already on site with his survey crew when we arrived. He was standing near the barn talking on a phone, a man in his late 50s who looked like he was accustomed to being the most important person in any outdoor setting he occupied. He turned when he heard Chester's car on the gravel. He did not look happy to see Deputy Oakes. He looked even less happy when I stepped out of my truck. "What is this?" he said, walking toward us. "Who are you people? This is a closed site. We are in the middle of a survey." I let Chester carry the briefcase. I buttoned my blazer. I walked toward Gary Briggs at a pace that communicated I was not in a hurry because I had nothing to be in a hurry about. "My name is Robert Harmon," I said. "I own this property." Briggs frowned. "You don't own this property. We closed on this parcel last Thursday. I have the recorded deed." "You have a recorded deed for the surface rights," I said. "I would like to talk to you about what it does not include." He looked at me, the way people look at someone speaking a language they almost recognize. Confusion, then irritation, then the beginning of real concern. Chester opened the briefcase. The conversation that followed was not short. Briggs called his company's legal department from the driveway. He was on the phone for 40 minutes, pacing, reading sections of the document Chester had handed him, occasionally looking at me with an expression I had seen before on the faces of men who realize they have built on a foundation someone else owns. Pinnacle's attorney was on speaker before the first hour was finished. "Let me be plain with you," I said into the phone. 14 years ago, I conveyed all subsurface mineral rights for this parcel to an LLC called Iron Rock Holdings. That deed is recorded in the Wyoming Mineral Rights Index at the county clerk's office. Iron Rock Holdings is a Wyoming limited liability company with one member. That member is me. Pinnacle Energy purchased the surface rights to this property. It did not, and cannot, acquire the mineral rights without Iron Rock's written consent. Without those mineral rights, you cannot legally drill, excavate, or extract any subsurface resource from this land. You purchased access to the grass. Everything beneath it belongs to me. There was a long silence from the phone. Briggs had gone pale in the way people go pale when they feel money leaving the room. The attorney on the phone said, voice careful and controlled, that they would need to review the mineral deed independently. I told him Chester would transmit a certified copy immediately. I told him I would be available to discuss Iron Rock's position at his convenience. Then I told him that his client should also speak with their legal team about the instrument by which this sale was executed, specifically the power of attorney signed by my son, claiming authority to act on my behalf in this transaction. I told him Chester had documentation establishing that power of attorney was obtained fraudulently, that I had never authorized it, and that the county attorney's office had been made aware. The silence from the phone this time had a different texture. It was the silence of a man doing mathematics he doesn't want to finish. Marcus arrived 45 minutes later. Diane was with him. He must have gotten a call from Briggs because he drove up fast, the expensive lease car, fishtailing slightly on the gravel, and he got out while the car was still rocking on its springs. He was wearing vacation clothes, light linen, expensive sunglasses. He and Diane had been in Scottsdale. I had known that because Chester had been watching the credit card activity on the $6 million proceeds, and they had used $22,000 in Scottsdale in 4 days. He stopped when he saw me. He stopped the way you stop when you see something your brain takes a moment to accept as real. "Dad," he said. His voice had the particular quality of a man trying to project authority he has already lost. "What are you doing here? You shouldn't be on this property. This is a Pinnacle site now." I didn't move. I looked at my son. I looked at him the way you look at something you made with your hands that has come apart, not with anger, not anymore, but with the clear-eyed assessment of an engineer examining a structural failure. I asked him a question. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted him to say it. "Why did you do it this way?" I asked. "If you needed money, why didn't you ask me?" He blinked. "Dad, you weren't going to sell. You never would have sold." "Then it wasn't yours to sell," I said. Diane put her hand on his arm. He straightened up. The Scottsdale sunglasses came off. "It doesn't matter," he said. "The deal is done. The money is transferred. You can't undo this." He said it with the confidence of a man who believes that completed transactions are permanent. That money in hand is a conclusion rather than a beginning. That the only law that matters is the one that ended in his favor. Chester stepped forward. He handed Marcus a document, a copy of the Iron Rock Holdings mineral deed, and below it, the power of attorney fraud filing we had submitted to the county attorney 3 days prior. Marcus read the first page, then the second. I watched the confidence in his posture drain downward like water finding an exit. "What is this?" he said. What is Iron Rock Holdings? It is a Wyoming LLC that owns all subsurface mineral rights to this property, Chester said. It was established 14 years ago and recorded properly at the county clerk. Pinnacle Energy purchased the surface rights to this land. They did not acquire Iron Rock's holdings because Iron Rock is not a party to this transaction and never authorized the sale of its interests. Marcus looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the ground. You sold Pinnacle Energy the lid of a jar, I said. What they came here for is still inside it. They paid $6 million for the surface of a parcel they cannot extract resources from. That's a problem for Pinnacle. But the larger problem is that you sold something under a fraudulent power of attorney, which means you received $6 million through a defective legal instrument. Chester, you want to tell him what that is called? Chester adjusted his glasses. It is called wire fraud. It is a federal offense. The county attorney is already reviewing the filing. Diane made a sound I had never heard from her before. It was a very small sound, almost a whisper, and it had nothing practiced in it. It was the sound of someone understanding, all at once, the exact shape of the hole they are standing in. Marcus turned to me. His voice had changed. The authority was entirely gone. Dad. He said it the way he used to say it when he was 10 years old and had broken something he was forbidden to touch. Dad. Okay. I made a mistake. We can fix this. Just tell Chester to withdraw the filing. Tell Pinnacle there was a misunderstanding. We can renegotiate. Put the mineral rights into the deal. Make it a clean package. You will still get the money. We all benefit. Just help us fix it. How much of the $6 million is left? I asked. His mouth opened. Closed. How much, Marcus? We had some debts, he said quietly. How much is left? He looked at Diane. She looked at her shoes. A little over $3 million, he said. I nodded. So you spent $3 million in 8 days. We had things we needed to take care of. I thought about that for a moment. $3 million in 8 days, the condo, the car payments, whatever else. And a 4-day stay in Scottsdale that cost $22,000. Deputy Oakes stepped forward. He hadn't said a word the entire time. He had just stood there, with his hands folded in front of him, and the star on his chest, doing the quiet work that stars on chests do in tense situations. Sir, Oakes said, looking at Marcus. I've been made aware of a fraud complaint filed in connection with the power of attorney instrument used in this transaction. I'm going to need you to stay on the property while we sort out the documentation. Marcus went very still. Am I being detained? He asked. You are being asked to remain on site, Oakes said. I'd suggest you call an attorney. Diane took out her phone. Her hands were shaking enough that she dropped it on the gravel and had to pick it up. She went to stand by the car. Marcus looked at me. His eyes were doing something I hadn't seen since he was a child, moving fast, searching, looking for the exit that wasn't there. Dad, he said. Dad, please. I know what I did was wrong. I know it. But you can still fix this. You own Iron Rock. You can authorize the mineral rights transfer. It makes the deal whole. Pinnacle gets what they came for. We keep the money. The fraud complaint goes away. Because there's no damaged party anymore. Just sign over the mineral rights. That's all. Please. I looked at my son for a long time. I thought about the 3 weeks he had spent here after my hip surgery, bringing me soup, driving me to physical therapy. I thought about whether any of that had been real or whether it had been reconnaissance. I thought about the power of attorney he had filed with a notary he paid in Adams County while I was 60 miles away in a hospital gown waiting for an imaging technician. I thought about Margaret's rocking chair pushed to the side wall of my living room so Diane could measure the square footage. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the jewelry box. I held it in my hand and looked at the blue flowers on the white pine that Margaret had painted in a class the year before she died. Your mother made this, I said. Marcus's eyes went to the box. She made it in a class at the community center in Cheyenne. It took her 4 sessions. She came home after the last one, and she couldn't stop smiling. She put her ring in it and my watch, and she said, now we have somewhere safe for the things that matter most. I looked at him. You did not put this in the things that matter most category, I said. You left it on the counter. Dad, I could authorize the transfer, I said. Iron Rock Holdings would survive. Pinnacle would get their mineral rights. The deal would close clean. The fraud complaint would have no damaged party, and it would likely be dismissed. You and Diane would walk away with whatever is left of $3 million, and a lesson you probably wouldn't learn. Marcus exhaled. His shoulders dropped. But I'm not going to, I said. He looked up. You didn't ask me. You didn't come here and sit at my table and say, Dad, we are in trouble. You didn't say, Dad, we need help. You hired a locksmith and a notary, and you waited until I was in a hospital gown, and you signed my name on a document that transferred my home while I was gone. You took something that was not yours, and you dressed it up in legal language, and you called it an estate decision. The wind came down from the ridge and moved through the gold grass, and I let it pass before I spoke again. You are going to face what you did, I said. Chester is going to cooperate fully with the county attorney and with Pinnacle Energy's legal team. I am not going to save you from the consequences of a decision you made without me, about my land, using my name, without my knowledge. Oakes moved toward Marcus. Chester was on the phone with the county attorney's office, speaking quietly. Pinnacle's Gary Briggs was back on the phone with his own attorneys, and I could hear from his tone that the conversation had moved into territory that would be expensive for everyone. Marcus didn't fight when Oakes asked him to come to the deputy's vehicle. He didn't run. He walked, and the walk of a man going somewhere he doesn't want to go is a particular and unmistakable thing. Diane followed, no longer on her phone, her Scottsdale sunglasses pushed up on her head, looking like the accessories from a version of this day that no longer existed. At the vehicle, Marcus turned and looked at me one more time across the length of the driveway. I didn't look away. I also didn't go to him. There was nothing to say that the law wasn't already saying more efficiently. I walked to the house. The key still worked. Marcus had not thought to change the lock. Inside, the kitchen smelled like it always smelled: old pine and something indefinably familiar, the accumulated scent of 30 years of meals and winters and mornings. Margaret's coffee mug was still in the cabinet. I had not moved it in 2 years, and I did not move it now. I walked to the living room. I picked up Margaret's walnut rocking chair and carried it back to its position in the corner by the south window, the window that looks out toward the ridge. I set it down. I sat in it. The wood made a small sound as it settled under my weight, the same sound it had made 10,000 times before. Through the window I could see the gold grass moving on the ridge. Chester appeared in the doorway 15 minutes later. He had a look on his face that lawyers get when they have finished an enormous amount of work correctly. Pinnacle is already in contact with their insurers, he said. They'll pursue Marcus for the fraudulent instrument. The county attorney wants a formal statement next week, and I spoke briefly with Oakes. Marcus and Diane are going to be spending some time answering questions. I nodded. Chester looked at me. He looked at the rocking chair and the jewelry box on the side table and the window and the ridge. What do you want to do about the mineral rights? He asked. Pinnacle will come back. Once the dust settles, they will want to negotiate properly. The reserves under your east pasture are substantial. You could be looking at a very significant licensing agreement if you choose to negotiate. I know, I said. Is that something you want to pursue? I looked at the hawk circling above the ridge, patient and unhurried, going around again. In time, I said. Right now I just want to sit here. Chester nodded. He understood. He set his briefcase down by the door and went to the kitchen, and I heard him fill the kettle, and I heard the gas click on beneath it, and I sat in Margaret's chair while the wind came down off the ridge, and the hawk circled, and the grass moved, and the house held its ground the way it always had. $3 million cannot buy what it costs them. That is the thing about greed. It treats everything as inventory and forgets that some things hold the structure together. Take them out and the whole building comes down. Not gradually, but all at once. In the particular way that load-bearing failures happen without warning, without appeal, and with consequences for everything that trusted them to hold. I learned what I needed to teach my son the only way it could be taught, not by telling him, but by letting the contract hold. If you have ever had to let someone face the consequences of what they chose to do to you, leave me your story in the comments. I read every one. And if you believe that a man has the right to protect what he built, hit the like button. It matters more than you know. Until next time, stay standing.